Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Wednesday Lives with Trey and Jay. I'm Trey.
Hey, I'm Jay, and we're
Listen,
excited to be here.
absolutely, because we have a whole guest for y'all today. Janelle is going to be the one to introduce him, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining this channel. As you already know, on here, we share our lives to encourage others to love God, love themselves, and love others well. And so, as we are having a whole entire month on back to basics, like pull up, y'all. How have y'all been enjoying that? Like,
I hope you've
get
enjoyed
into the
it.
comments, okay? Get into the comments because I don't know about y'all, but I know for a fact we have been enjoying it.
I mean,
And so, yes. So, with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Janelle. You can pull up and introduce our guest. Like, pop, pop, pop. Stay tuned, y'all.
first, before we introduce the guests, I just want to reiterate what Back to Basics is about. Oh, well, actually, we didn't talk about it for this particular live, and so Back to Basics is literally that we are going back to the fundamental principles of the Christian faith. Why? Because it's always good to make sure that your foundation is tight, right? We all understand if you build a house on a crazy loose foundation, it doesn't last. And so we want to make sure that our foundation, or if you are new to the Christian faith, you know what the fundamental basic principles are. And so the first week we talked about what is the gospel, straight up, like bare bones, what is the gospel? So you can check that out. And the second week we talked about who is Jesus. And so today we want to talk about the topic, if you can actually question God. So the question is, can you question God? And a lot of us think no. But we have teaching pastor, podcast host, father, husband. He's a bomb Bible teacher. He's the
Go to y'all.
yes.
Period.
He's a teaching pastor of the Bridge Church in Brooklyn, and so we are so excited to have Pastor Rasool on. Hello.
What's up, ladies? So
What's
glad to
through
be
with
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 you.
the big background? Meanwhile, we over here with the white. You got the
Just
brick
plain
for us. Okay.
Yes, but
Oh
we are
man.
excited to have you. Thank you so much for being on with us. It is our pleasure to have
Mm.
you on, and we know that you could be doing anything else. We know you're traveling, you're speaking, you have your own podcast. Yeah, tell us about the podcast real quick before we get into everything.
Yes. We launched the Where You From podcast just a few weeks ago. We're putting out an episode a week, and it's called Where You're From because we feel like in this time that we're living in particular. And it's so interesting that we're asking a question because the podcast is actually the title is a question,
Yeah.
and it's a way to engage with people and go and walk into their stories and to see what it is, how they got to where they got to, right? So the first host guest that we had was Lisa Fields from the Jude 3 Project,
We
a
love
strong
Lisa.
sister that is just doing incredible things with helping people with questions and what they have with their faith. And so we get to hear the backstory of her life to see that it was in college when she was challenged in her faith, which is why she began to see the importance of knowing why you believe what you believe. And that's why she started U3. But we
Mhm.
get to hear the backstory. And I think when you hear people's backstories, it's so inspiring. We were just talking about how you were listening to Rich Perez and just hearing his journey into filmmaking, which was that was our third episode that we just put out last week, helps you to know, okay, I can do this thing. And
Yeah.
that's a space that I can make. So we want to bring inspiration. We want to bring insight and encouragement. And that's what we're doing with Where You're From. So you can check it out wherever you get your podcasts. Where, excuse me, where YA from is how you spell it. So I'm glad to be here. And I'm all about questions. That's what I'm all about. So I'm really
That's
excited
great
to dive into it.
because I asked all the questions.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
Good.
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
So let's jump into it. Why? Okay, so let's get into, can you question
Yeah.
God? Can
Yeah.
you question God? What do you think?
Well, one of the things that is helpful for me always is to kind of frame who else is asking this question and thinking about these things. And there's a research group called Barna, the Barna Group,
Mm-hmm.
that does a lot of research in exploring what are trends in, especially in America, as it relates to faith. And they put out a report in 2017 that said that 65% of people who self-identify as Christians are questioning, what they believe, right? So one of the things that it's just helpful to know that you're not alone
Yeah.
when you have that kind of streak in you where you start to wonder things. There's a book that has been very kind of instrumental for me in terms of thinking. It's called How Not to Be Secular.
Ah.
It's a book about a book because the guy that wrote this book is not the author. He's a philosopher named Charles Taylor. And there's the author of that book, How Not to Be Secular. His name is James K.A. Smith. And basically, to make a long story short, he talks about how we're living in a secular age. And what that means is that he uses this phrase that we live in contested space. And by that, is that we are inundated with various worldviews, belief
Yeah.
systems, ideas all the time. And the dominant one in our culture right now is actually non-belief, right? And that's the dominant one. So whenever you're in a contested space, it becomes very normal and natural to ask questions. But I would actually say that even this is not a new phenomenon, that from the very beginning in the Bible, we see people asking questions in the Bible, like right there. Questions about distance from God and doubt. David asked in Psalm 13, "How long, O Lord, will you ignore me forever? How long will you not pay attention to me? How long must I worry? How long will my enemies, gloat over me?" These are real questions. And look at the nature of the question. He's not saying, like, have you forgotten me or ignore me? He's in the moment saying, how long will you continue to?
Yeah.
There are questions about purpose and meaning in the book of Ecclesiastes. The writer says, what benefit do people get from all the effort with which they expend on earth? He's basically saying, what's the point of life?
Yeah.
What's the And so throughout scripture, there's a continual aspect of wrestling with God, of asking questions. And in fact, it's presented not as a deterrent to faith, but really as essential to faith. And that the reality is we all have questions. It's just a matter of who are we taking those questions to? And that's where we
Yeah.
can get in trouble. Are we taking those questions to God and to people who know him? Or are we taking them to some other source that's going to lead us in another direction?
Wow.
So I just as you were talking about that, one of the things that I was considering is, like, yes, of course you're talking about why we can question God, but I think the point also then becomes, why do we struggle
Yeah.
with asking God questions? Like,
Yeah.
where did we get the idea that we couldn't?
Yeah.
Or like, where in culture did we hear that we couldn't? Where in the world did we hear that we couldn't? Like, why is it? Because I understand that we can question, but why do we struggle with it?
Yeah.
Such a good question. And, it's interesting. I mentioned Lisa Fields earlier from Jude 3 Project. We actually just did the second part of her second season of a series she's doing called Why I Don't Go.
Yeah.
And in Why I Don't Go, she brought together people who used to go to church
Yeah.
and put them in a room and just started asking them questions. Why don't you go to church anymore? What did you miss from that experience? What do you like about not being in that place? What contributed to your decision? And so in the second season, I accompanied her and to this video shoot, which is going to be coming out in a few weeks. And this is what she has learned from having that. And she's mostly having that that conversation in Black spaces, right?
Yeah.
And what she found was that one of the chief reasons, probably the number one reason that people stop going to church is they believe that it's not a safe space for them to ask questions, that if they ask something or if they question something that they hear, it's immediately shot down or blasted as a character issue. Well, you just better trust God. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. And that kind of stifling of and even a sort of scorn attached to
Yeah.
that process of questioning has caused people to go. Literally, there was one young lady that we talked to that was just kind of like, I don't want all that drama with people, so I just decided, okay, I guess I can't bring this here, so then I can't bring my full self here, so then I left. And so they were so surprised by just the experience that is we were engaging with them, we were encouraging them that, yeah, sure, ask your questions, have your doubts, like
Yeah.
there's a place for that in the journey of faith. But I think that in previous times and in certain contexts, people think that the best way to respond to questions and to doubt is to suppress it and to basically just try to push it down and just try to challenge the people and make them say, look, you're bad because you even had that question, that it's somehow a lack of faith. But the
Yeah.
reality is that when we see in the scriptures, the question is not, will I have questions? Because we all experience things, a loss in our family that hits close to home, or
Yeah.
some crisis in the world, a tragedy like a pandemic,
Yeah.
and people die. Like, and we all have those type of issues, or just something you read in the scripture and go, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. And so it is really a disservice to people to shut that down. But I think that ends up being a key reason why. And then one last piece, and this is another sociological dynamic. I was a sociology. That's where I got my degree in college. So that I think about these things a lot. That's what's up. Shout out sociology. But so when you look at Gen X, when you look at millennials and Gen Z in particular, that those are two generations that are typically looking to peers for insight and perspective about things, as opposed to looking at older generations. And so one of the reasons why there's a sense of not questioning, and I think that comes from a experience with older generations that basically said it wasn't safe for me to ask that question, or I'm gonna get I'm gonna get shot down. And so I basically don't do that. And so I think those things contribute. But the problem is when your peers don't have the answers either, then what do you do, right? Because it's like, then they may know the same as much as I do. So where do I go with it then?
Isn't that crazy?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm realizing that a lot of like what you said, we asking questions is a sign of rebellion in certain cultures. From my culture, that's what it is. For my family, everything is rude. Everything is everything is disrespectful. At least I have a Caribbean Central American background, and both sides of my family, it's like, you ask, why do I have to do this? Like, oh, why do I have to take out I don't know, whatever it is, it's, you're being rude, sit down, shut up, so I can totally see that being the case in the church. Not that I can totally see, I've seen it and I've experienced it. But also I think it's because a lot of times those who are being asked don't have the answers. And so they completely, reject those who are asking the. I was watching one of Jude 3 projects, something they just put out, and it was a young lady who left the church, who now is into, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but she's into,
it was like African spirituality.
Yeah, right. And so she said that was one of the main things she said, and it broke my heart. She said, I was just asking simple questions because there were new things that were happening in my life. I was getting dreams and visions and all these things, and I was shut down by everyone. And this is a church that I've grew up in, and I love them. So for her, it's a community, but that's it. She didn't find faith there. She didn't find God there. And so that's why I love the fact that you said that you love when people ask questions. We have to educate ourselves. And so how do we, as believers, get prepared when people ask us questions? Because like we should be able to be asked the questions, right? And so how do we make sure that we know?
I just have to tip on that one real quick, because, and I'm not trying to cut you off, Rasool, but because I definitely want you to get in this, but I think that going back to the way that we are raised, often what happens is our cultural dynamics is what we then translate to our relationship with Jesus, right? So
Absolutely.
If culturally I don't ask questions, I cannot ask questions because it is rude, because it is disrespectful, because don't nobody got the answer, or because I'm supposed to just sit down and shut up. You know what I'm
And take
saying?
it. Yeah.
And take it, because so then what ends up happening is I'm going to translate that to my relationship with Jesus and be like, so I have these questions, but you know what, God, it doesn't make sense for me to even ask because I don't even know how to ask questions because I haven't had the experience of asking questions and being okay or in a safe space to ask questions in the first place. And that kind of goes to like oftentimes how we talk about how we transition our minds around our earthly fathers to God our Father. And if
Yeah.
we had a really contentious experience with our earthly fathers, then we could potentially have a real contentious experience with our heavenly Father. So I hear that kind of. I know it was quite a bit that was just said, but I do want to hear your take on that because I think it's not just a matter of lack of faith.
Yeah.
It's like there's an unsafe space of speaking,
Yeah.
just
Yeah. Because they think
speaking.
that God is angry at them too, which I have felt for a long time. So
To ask a
that's
question, yeah,
right.
just to
So it's
ask a
like,
question, he's mad.
yeah,
Yeah,
like he's
absolutely,
angry at me. So therefore,
Mhm.
why would I even like do that? Why would I even
absolutely.
challenge him in asking questions because of, like you said, the background that a lot of us have.
Yeah, no, that's all good insights and perspectives, and I think that's why I'm glad that you guys started with what is the gospel from a
Yeah.
foundation standpoint, because you kind of got to go back to there and like, who is Jesus? Because when I
Mhm.
understand fundamentally, gospel means good news, and the good
Right.
news is that God literally came to us, in the form of Jesus, so that we could have relationship with Him. What that means in verse 14 of John chapter 1, it says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we beheld His glory." And
Mhm.
so what you see when you see Jesus interacting with people as they ask him questions, you don't see him saying, "Girl, what you asking me questions for? Don't you know I'm
How
Jesus?"
dare
You
you?
know what I mean? You gotta trust and have faith. That's not how Jesus responds. And there were a lot of questions that were posed to Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think so. The one thing is to remember that the good news is that is pursuing us. It wants us to be in a relationship with Him, and has revealed Himself in a way that we can actually understand and come to know personally. And that's a very powerful thing. And but part of that is also recognizing that this is a step of faith in order to do it. But I can have a reasonable faith. It's not what they call a blind faith, right? Like it's not faith like in
Mhm.
spite of my mind.
Yeah.
In fact, in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, this was one of my favorite verses when I first came to faith in college that really drew me. It says, "Come, let us reason together."
Right.
God says, "Come, let us reason
Right.
together," to the people.
Welcome.
Like, what? Come on. Like, I'm not, when I started to realize God was not scared of my mind, in fact, He put that inside of
Oh,
me so that I can
Rasool,
help.
please repeat that. Stop it. I'm pausing you right here. I'm throwing the
He
shoe
doesn't want
at
you to be brainless.
right
He wants you.
now.
He wants your personality, right? He wants your
Yes,
gifts, your talents, your brain.
right. God is not afraid of our minds. In fact,
Yeah.
He gave us our minds so that we could draw closer to Him and understand more Him better. That's why when it says, "Look out into the world, look out into the expanse," it has written His signature in it. And so, the first thing is a posture that recognizes that God says, "Come, come, come. We could talk. We could talk. You can ask me all the things that are deep." Because sometimes people, and as pastors, we talk to folks, and I'll never forget it. I was in downtown Brooklyn, and we were at a restaurant, me and the lead pastor, and there was a person who's hostess at the restaurant, and she kind of does the thing that when people know that you're pastors, they're like, "Look, I know I'm gonna get right. I'm gonna come back to church," and we
Always,
were like, "Yo, we're chilling.
girl.
We
Right.
just, we're good." But when we started to ask her questions, what it came down to, she said, "Yeah, I was a senior in college, And my mom, you know, who had been the anchor in my life and had been this minister, and she would stop and was the godliest person I knew. And 2 months before I graduated from college, she died of cancer. And I got issues with God now, and I got questions. And but from that moment, she just didn't know or didn't understand. She thought that it was just something she had to work out and maybe just put on pause, as opposed to
Yeah.
recognizing that the problem of suffering, the problem of pain, the problem of grief is something that, if you read the book of Job, you see he
Yeah.
had a whole
Yeah.
lot of questions.
A
You know
whole
what I
lot.
mean? And struggles with what was going on. And so that is a very understandable place to be in. And I think that God gives us invitation in that space so
Yeah.
that not necessarily, and here's the thing, not necessarily so that I have all the answers that I want, but that I know that God is drawing me with the questions. He's not afraid, he's not angry at me, and that I can find something that's even better than an answer. You
Right.
know what's better than the answer? Himself, his
Yeah.
presence in the midst of it. And so, but that comes through the process of wrestling. That comes through the process of really engaging in a way. And so I think I start there with myself and how I orient myself to the questions and the doubts that come out
Yeah.
and that come up before I can even think about inviting someone else, and how do I respond to people's questions now. Because so and this is the first thing, it's important for us to leave space for the mystery of God.
Oh yes.
Our brains, our human brains, are not sufficient to understand. Again, God says, "My ways are not your ways, my thoughts are not your thoughts." And so, what that means is, I can come to God with questions, but in the same way that when now this is where having some parents that have a strong sense of authority can kind of help out sometimes. Because sometimes stuff was like, stay out of grown folks' business, right?
Yeah.
Like that ain't for you to know. Like, and there are things I can say as a parent that's like, I'm not about to tell you that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like that's just not, in my best in my daughter's best interest
Best
sometimes.
interest. Mhm.
And so so there is that component. And so the first thing is recognizing that mystery is a part of the faith. And I'm not afraid of that living in a secular society, because guess what? Mystery is a part of life. We
Yeah.
still don't have all the answers. Nobody has all the answers to
Right.
everything. And
Right.
so when I recognize that the goal in life is not to get all my questions answered, but the goal in life is to draw closer to the one who has those questions and who is wanting to do something inside of me in my pursuit of him, instead of
Yeah.
the pursuit just of the answers. So, and the reason why I had to start there is because when I start there, when someone then asks me a question about the faith, I don't feel the pressure and the weight of the
Right.
world that I have to answer this question, or else this person may leave the faith or not trust God, and it'll be my fault. Like,
Yeah.
that was never a burden that we were supposed to bear. And because
Yeah.
people put that burden on them, they become scared to death of when
Yes.
people want to ask them questions. But
Yes.
I'm like, I can guess,
That's
because
something
some
that
of
you
the
put on yourself.
Right.
yeah,
I
what
lived like
one of the
that for a long time, so I get
yeah,
it. And then I'm like,
yeah,
salvation is not up to me and what I say.
no. And one of the best answers to a question, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
Right.
But you know what? I'm gonna go look it up, and I'm gonna go, and I'll get back to you. Sometimes
Yeah.
that's the best answer to a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
we're not supposed to know everything. So so the second part of that is when I recognize that there's mystery, and I recognize that it is not up to me to have all the answers.
Yeah.
Now I can then begin to engage the question. Now, the third part of this, and this is where helping to study Jesus is very important. Do you know how many questions Jesus asked in the New Testament?
A
I
lot.
want y'all to guess.
I don't know.
I would
He asked
say
a lot. I mean, I know he asked questions.
I'm saying like several. I'm not like a lot.
She's like, I ain't gonna give
You
you a
want to
number,
get
but I'm saying
well, or like,
over 300 questions in the Gospels. Jesus is recorded asking over 300.
he asked a
Now, of
lot of
course,
questions.
that's a lot of questions. And here's the thing, depending on the nature of the question and the questioner, he responded to the question differently. And so, one of the ways that we get ourselves in trouble is that we don't follow Jesus's example of how he asked questions. So the first part about that, what I mean is not every question deserves an answer.
Mm.
What do I mean by that?
You know why
What
I'm
I mean,
laughing? My
You
husband.
better come through with the boundaries.
yes, Jesus had some great boundaries,
Yes.
and he used those boundaries because he recognized that sometimes people were asking him questions not because they wanted to know the answer, but because they were trying to hem him up. So, for example, toward the end of his ministry, some of the Pharisees and scribes came to him and they said, by what authority are you doing these things? He had just flipped over the money tables in the temple because they were making God's house a den of thieves, right? So prosperity pimps and preachers ain't new, right? Like there's always been people hustling, trying to make money in God's name. And they were doing that, and Jesus got upset. So he flipped over the tables and got, and said, look. And so they said, what authority do you have to do these things? Who gave you what right do you have, Jesus, to do this? So then this is what Jesus says. All right, you answer my question and I answer your question. The baptism of John, where did it come from? Was it from man or was it from God? And it says they gather together and they go, if we say the baptism of John was from man, meaning that it was John just doing his own thing all out there willy-nilly out of pocket, then the people are going to get mad at us because they believe that John was a prophet. They're like, yeah, so we can't say it was a man. But then if we say that John's baptism was from a God, was from above, then they can say, well, why didn't you believe him? Because they didn't believe in John the Baptist and they rejected him. So then Jesus, they come back to Jesus after the huddle and they say, we don't know. We don't know where his baptism was from. So you know what Jesus said? He said, well, neither am I going to answer your question about what authority that I have to do these things. Bam! I was like, oh, snap.
He was savvy. He was savvy. He was quick with it.
And so this is the action point for us. What he recognized was that they were not really seeking an answer. Why am I giving answers to people who are not seeking them? The Bible says that's casting pearls before swine. Yeah. So sometimes we get hemmed up when we really need to get to the deeper level of what's causing someone to ask the question. Someone might be, asking on the surface, like, well, man, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering? Right. And it's like, I can go into this big theological, philosophical question, but really they might be asking, yo, man, why did my grandma have to die? Mm-hmm. And isn't that a different question to answer than this big philosophical thing? And sometimes people don't even know that they're doing it, but sometimes they are. Sometimes they just trying to hem you up because they just trying to trap you into something. So one is the first tactic in terms of answering questions is that not all questions deserve an answer. Yeah. Now, the ones that they do, then that's when we know to do so with compassion and entering into a dialogue. But notice too, what Jesus did is not every question deserves a. Sometimes I have to answer a question with a question. Yeah. Sometimes I have to answer a question with a question, not to be slick or to be funny, but to get some more information. Like, that's a really good question. Before I answer, I want to be able to know kind of where that's coming from. Why is that something in particular that you asked? And then you can kind of draw from there, when Mary and Martha go to Jesus after Lazarus died, and they say, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Jesus didn't give him. He just, he actually was like, he said, show me to him. He wept at Lazarus's grave. And then he also asked him the question, whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And that got to the point of like, yo, I'm about to resurrect your brother from the dead. Like, do you believe who I am, who I said I am? Mm-hmm. So I'll stop there, but I think that is a key component, is to know how to ask questions. And then the last thing I'll say to that is avoid closed questions, like yes or no questions, but asking more open-ended questions that promote dialogue. And I think those are some good principles with which to lead other people into questions.
So I think what you were saying was it's so good, but I do want to get to what I was clear on, and I think that others would be clear on, is the fact that yes, you can, and you don't have to have the answers for everything.
Yeah.
because we're coming from a place of, potentially like shutting down questions and
Right.
being able to like listen to a person, hear
Right.
a person.
Yeah.
Um, Oftentimes, questions may come off as, or not answering the question or not having the answer for the question may seem like a judgment. Oh, maybe you shouldn't have asked that question. And it's
Right.
like, no, you can totally ask your questions.
Right.
Um, and if the person doesn't know, that is totally okay. Like they're not
Yeah.
Jesus to know that
Right.
answer to the question, and they don't have to know the question, like the answer to the question. Obviously, there are certain questions that you should know the answer to when it comes
Mhm.
to why do you believe and what
Right.
do you believe. Like there's
Mhm.
just certain like foundational, which is obviously where we're coming from. We're back to basics. Like there are some foundational
Yeah.
questions to yourself, right? There's some foundational questions to you that you should
Mhm.
desire to be able to know. You know what I'm saying? Because you're just like, if I truly believe this, when I'm asked a question of why do I believe this, I'm not saying I can come back with a what's that thing, like a memorized version of my response, but I should still be able to respond to that type
Yeah.
of a question,
Yeah.
right? So I just want to, be clear that it is not like, oh, we not answering any of your questions. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, no,
Yeah.
we are
Yeah.
answering, like, we can't, there's certain questions, yes, of course, but if you're
Yes.
talking about why does this happen? Why is this existing? And why does this, why did the grandma pass away? Like all of those things, and not super duper spiritualize it. And that's the question that I want
Yeah.
to talk to you about is what happens when we are asking questions. I have two questions actually. What would you say are some of popular questions that people ask of God? And in that same breath, what are some questions that we can truly respond to without trying to super duper spiritualize the thing on some like
Yeah.
God knows, like it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yep.
that's kind of the question.
Okay. Yeah, that's good, and I'm glad you kind of brought it back up because I definitely think that for the most part, people ask questions from a genuine place. I did want to try to take some of the stress off of people
Mm-hmm.
when like if I'm walking by a group of Hebrew Israelites and they got a microphone and they're like,
Mm-hmm.
so why do you worship on Sunday? And it's
Right.
like that is not the time and the
But
place to
yeah.
be
Yeah.
engaging. And so all questions aren't created equal in terms of the intent of the person. They're not trying to have a dialogue. They're trying to just kind of put you on blast in that
Yeah.
setting. And so it is important to be able to be discerning about what is this or is the space I'm in. But like I said, and like you just said, because majority people, that 65% of even people questioning their own faith, let alone how many people who are interested in spiritual things. I've seen that during the pandemic as things got time to shut down and some people just started really asking questions about what they, believed or what they were looking for
Yeah,
in life. We've seen a lot more people come to our
yeah,
church that we hadn't seen before.
yeah,
And I think that it's an important skill is the biggest point to know how to respond to people's questions. And I think the
yeah,
biggest thing is to recognize that a question is an invitation to a dialogue and not a monologue.
Yeah.
And
mm,
and so what I mean by that is don't lose the opportunity to ask follow-up questions to get more clarity
Yeah.
about why the person is asking what they're asking and what it is that they're really thinking about and struggling with. Early on in my faith journey and as I began to really share my faith, I made the mistake of just thinking every time someone asked a question, it was like because they just wanted this particular information and then I would go into these long-winded, kind of soliloquies, which people aren't really into. But man, when you use that as an opportunity to engage in conversation, it changes the dynamic. And there are some very common questions that are
Mhm.
around now. I kind of suggested and implied it in my question about or the story I told about the young lady and the hostess, and a lot of people are struggling with the question of suffering.
Yeah.
and why, you know, why are bad things happening? Why are we in the midst of a pandemic? What, you know, why did somebody why do bad things happen to good people, right? That kind of aspect. And because we have access to a 24-hour news cycle, that we have literally, you know, you can go like from Afghanistan to Haiti to New Orleans and just see new, you know, then you go on somebody's Facebook, somebdy's
Yep.
like, and
Yep.
it's
Yep.
very like,
Yeah.
it's intense.
At the tip of your fingers.
Yeah, at the
It's
tip of your fingers.
intense.
And
Yeah.
so I think, so the way our brains are now exposed and saturated with so much news, it is like it can be overwhelming to try to process that. And I think people are trying to process that. Another thing that is particularly a journey is people, you know, as there's been this racial awakening that's happened over the last 5 years, and people wondering, is Christianity compatible with my journey into reconnecting with my culture and my Black
Yeah.
heritage and my Black roots? And of course, that's a question that I love when people ask, because I'm like, oh, you don't even understand the answer to that. Like, Christianity is so old in Africa. One African scholar said that it can be considered an indigenous African religion. You know, the practice of Christianity that we have now is actually older than the current practices of Yoruba now in Nigeria, in terms of like when you look at, it gets deep when you look at you know, how, like the way that, because everything evolves. It's not just, you know, things stay the same. So when you like look at the Ethiopian Coptic Church, or that derives itself even from the Ethiopian Jews who were there, you're talking thousands of years in Africa and practicing in that way, that you see that there is no incompatibility with my expression of my Africanness, my African Americanness, and my faith, even though I do live in a world in which, because of colonialism and imperialism, it can look like that because you see these whitewashed images. And that's where, speaking of the whitewashing of Christianity, my man Jerome Gay wrote this great
Oh
book called
yeah.
The Whitewashing of Christianity. Great book that explains that. So it becomes helpful to educate yourself to be able to know. But those are some major questions that come up, and that you know, sexual questions,
Yeah.
ethics questions that come up nowadays, that I see a lot that people are wrestling with.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay.
So good.
So
So
good.
No, we're both like, and so we actually are supposed to be a 30-minute show. But you were spitting some things that we were like, we cannot stop him, because you know it's just so
Right.
important. So I hope you all like really like got some things out of this, because you know there was so much good, we would call gems, right? Or like what, like he was just spitting fire. Trey, do you have anything that you want to, right? Do you want anything that you want to say before we leave? We're done. We're wrapping up.
So apart from saying thank you, I do want you to let us know how we can reach you, how we can get in contact with you. And shout out to, I know you did say, just kind of talk about all the things, because I know you talked about your podcast, the church, and all of that. So please be sure to sprinkle all that in.
So yeah, on IG, I'm at Rasool B. That's RASOOLB. Twitter, Rasool Berry. Same thing on Facebook. And yeah, if you have questions, if you're struggling with something, you know, in your faith, or just, you know, in life, please, you know, feel free to drop me a note, and I'll try to my best to respond in a timely way. And yeah, definitely also check out the Where You're From podcast. We're going to be exploring all of those hot button topics. It's really the intersection of culture and faith. And so, you know, the episode we just did with my friend KB was on friends and friendships, and the importance of that.
We're looking forward to being featured as well. Shout out to that.
Yes.
Where you're from. Pull up into the email, Rasool. Give us a date and time.
We will be there.
We'll have Trey and Jay right in there. Oh, we will be there.
Yes, we would make that happen. So yeah, definitely check out the podcast, and then I would say, just, you know, continue to read and expand your mind. And the last thing is a pastor. This is what I want to say. It is really like, we're here. What we commit our lives to, if you are at a church, is to help people grow and to be shepherds of the flock. I know that it can sometimes be maybe intimidating because of the conversation that we just had about sometimes being looked down upon.
Yeah.
But I would just give the pastor the opportunity to be able to respond to, your questions, because that's what we're there for. So if you have some type of, and it doesn't ask, it might be a deacon at your church, or it might be some type of ministry leader, but try to go that route, I would say, first. And if that comes up short, then kind of expand the search. But you definitely want to go to your church community, because it's tough when you hear people deconstructing their faith outside of your presence. Like, but you were with us for like 5 years. Like you've sat under my teaching. Why wouldn't you at least give me an opportunity to kind of walk you through that process? So I would just say bring that. And then of course the last part is just prayer. There's no substitute for talking to God, and ultimately he's the expert about himself.
Yeah.
And so whenever that comes up, I would just encourage you with that. Thank you all so much. Trey and Jay, is always a privilege and a pleasure to interact with y'all and to be part of the show. So thank you.
Yeah, man. This thing we got to talk about is deconstructing our faith. Like, people who have that is a hot button, and I totally understand why. So thank you for being on with us, and it's been a pleasure to have you on the show. So yeah, with that being said, y'all, we out.
Yes, we are out. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, this afternoon, this morning, whatever time you're watching it. But as you already know, on this channel, we share our lives to encourage others to love Jesus, love themselves, and love others well. We out, y'all.
Take care. Bye-bye.